So basically nothing that happens in the 40k universe is going to make sense unless you know what the warp is. It's totally central to how the setting works. It's also totally critical to any real literary analysis of it. So this is where we're going to start. So what is the warp? And we're going to try and be reasonably brief about this. Okay, so there is the material reality of 40k, the galaxy, where all of the, the purges and the space marines happens. There is also the warp. The warp is a plane of psychic energy that is mostly sealed away behind the veil of reality, where the material realm is governed by physics. The warp is not. It is the source of all cool, supernatural, non-physics things that you can do in 40k. So that's psychic powers, that's traveling faster than light, it's teleporting, it's doing all kinds of things. And in a sense, you can do pretty much whatever you like with the warp. You can make it, whatever you need it to do. You just squirt warp energy at it and hopefully it works. The warp is intimately tied to sentient beings. It fuels itself from the emotions and thoughts of not just humans, but Xenos, all kinds of living beings with souls. Because beings with souls are dual nature. They live in the material world and in the warp, the energy world, at the same time. So their thoughts, which start in the physical world, can shoot out into the warp, and that creates turbulence and storms and energy. If there were no sentient beings, the warp would just be a flat, dead calm. So the warp is interested basically in fueling itself, and so it wants to see, chaos. It wants to see extreme emotions. It wants to see death and destruction, because that feeds it. So there is some life in the warp, and they are demons and gods and things, but they are basically just clouds of energy that have a personality around them. They're not hugely well defined when they're in the warp. There's just amounts of energy, and all they want is more energy. They want to grow and become bigger, and they are not really thinking about things in any greater depth than that. They do hunger for all of this warp energy, but the warp exists outside of space-time. It doesn't really have an end goal because it exists both in the future and the past at the same time, so it doesn't have a goal. It's all just more energy. It's very Wile E. Coyote in that regard. It's just id and hunger. So the warp is really dangerous, but it's also really, really useful. If you want to travel between stars, the only way to do it is via the warp, one way or the other. It's the only way that you can travel faster than light, pretty much full stop. However, the only way to use warp stuff is with psychers, people who have a stronger connection to the warp, and every time that they do that, the demons can just flood out behind them. You can try to avoid some of that stuff, but there's always risks no matter what, and you just have to live with it. So the warp is super tempting and super powerful, and it's basically a way to just cheat material reality. And that's really how you should perceive of it. And sometimes we agree that cheating in communicating across the whole breadth of the galaxy is a good thing, and so we're willing to take the risks. But there's a whole lot more that the warp could do, but that's just way too dangerous, and so it's not good. But the warp does have these kind of interesting properties. If you're someone who is interested in cheating material reality somehow, the warp will let you tell the future, sort of. The warp will let you know the secrets of technology, sort of. It's very useful, it's very destructive. It will let you shoot lightning and raise demons and things. So it's powerful, and if you're someone who has nothing to lose, then it seems like it's a good way to get ahead. When mortal beings die, their souls dissolve into the warp once they don't have a physical body left. It's not very clear whether this is you just go to hell and get tortured by demons or not, but you definitely do naturally just dissolve into the warp when you die. this is actually kind of important because Chaos doesn't just want to kill mortal beings, right? When you die, you end up in the warp no matter what, and everyone dies eventually, so whatever, especially when you live in the future and the past at the same time. It doesn't make a huge amount of difference. What's important for the warp, though, is creating the intense emotionality that drives the warp. Yeah? They don't necessarily want to kill you. They want you to be a sort of an animalistic, emotionally driven madman, you know, who is driven by very extreme emotions and who tortures people to death. That's kind of its goal for life. You know, that's the way that the warp can profit off mortal life the best. And that was a slightly too long rundown of really what the warp is. There's a lot that you can get into. Let's get into, you know, the warp as a literary device, right? So it's drawing influences from lots of places. There's obviously a lot of religious imagery there, down to the gods and the demons and what have you. You know, the warp is almost literally the canonical Christian hell in some sense. There's also that kind of satanic sense, because the warp is always tempting people and always wants to steal their souls. You can make bargains with it, these kinds of things. That's clearly something that's there in it. You know, the warp is this great enemy, but it's also not something that has a guiding intelligence, and it doesn't have an obsession with humanity. It's not actually Satan. It just presents itself in that way when it suits its interests. The warp is more like a fire that has a personality to it. You know, the warp is a fire that can whisper to you to put more logs on the fire, or some gasoline, or some napalm. You know, it's more elemental. Another part of how chaos gets characterized is the idea of entropy, that overall, eventually, in time, the warp will win. And that it kind of only needs to get lucky once. But the whole meta-narrative of 40k is about rejecting that idea. And all of the great empires know what chaos is and are rejecting the fact and sort of trying to assert that actually their civilization really can stand forever. Particularly for humanity in the 40k universe, the whole thing is, if we stamp out the warp and we break the connection between humans and the warp, then our civilization can stand forevermore. It's not necessarily clear whether that could happen, but that's definitely in the narrative. That's what's driving humanity in the 40k world. I think it's tempting to kind of see that there's an order and chaos duality, obviously literally chaos on one side versus order, but I don't think that this fits very well. Normally when we talk about this kind of order and chaos and yin and yang, the idea is about balance and harmony and trying to kind of integrate the two together to make something grander. And you sort of could say that that's possible. You look at sort of the Eldar, who have more of that because they're a very psychic-y people, and they're much more connected to the warp than humanity is. But I think, you know, the day-to-day humanocentric view of it, nope, that is not how it's going to work. The goal of humanity is not to live in harmony with chaos. The warp is 100% the enemy and is to be rejected in any way possible. So as I said, the warp's end goal is not to eradicate life, and it's not to establish the empire of chaos. It's to establish the empire of animalism, this sort of barbarian, no self-control, primitive version of humanity. So it's an idea of living where the only forces are violence and murder, hedonism, and the constant churn of change. So when we look at this, we see that the battle with the warp is kind of the battle with our inner selves and our inner nature, and with our kind of our base emotions. And we're all about challenging ourselves to not give in to these urges, and in part because, you know, they're they're not a better nature by themselves, but also because it feeds the great enemy who wants to tear down your whole civilization. Because the warp gives this, the animalistic side of humanity, like a real force to it, and it's a really powerful force as well. It amps this internal conflict stuff up to 11. You have to be pure, or the demons might literally come and tear your world apart. So it's much more important, it's not just a personal quest, it's a civilization-wide quest to overcome the baser nature. Because of this sort of primitivist goal for sentient life, there's a bit of nuance to it as a force, because not even the followers of chaos are really following its agenda, or not really. We don't see cultists and chaos space marines as being like Diogenes the Cynic. It's all about them getting something, and often something specific, and it's not about this sort of end goal of emotionality. The followers of chaos are more emotionally driven, and they do use the power that gives them, but they are thinking in their own terms, whether they can have their own empires or whatever. They're not just following the end goal of the warp, or at least they don't think they are. But in the end, the warp is gonna eat you whole no matter what. You're useful to it when you seem to be, pursuing ends that end up in the same place, but eventually the warp will eat you. It just might eat you last. So what's the message here? I mean, I think it's actually quite a good message. As bad guys go, the bad guys tell us what the good guys stand for, and I think the warp sets the 40k universe up to have quite a robust, liberal, and to some degree secular message. We'll talk about the Imperial Creed at a later time, but the message that we get from the warp is that you can break the rules of everything, of time and space and physics. You can get ahead and be powerful, but breaking the rules always puts you on borrowed time, because the warp's going to eat your soul eventually, and whatever you do to stay on the good side of chaos is weakening all the rest of humanity. Whatever wars you're doing, whoever you're sacrificing, it's making the whole rest of the material universe less able to resist the enervating hunger of chaos. So going over to the warp can get you things, but it will not ever last, and everything else that you do tears down whatever anyone else is building as well. It's sort of doubly selfish in that regard. The whole purpose of the power at a price trope in storytelling is that it's telling us not to pay the price, right? It's that we have to stick to the rules. It doesn't matter what power or riches are being offered to you, the price is never worth it. And that, the only way that you can get ahead in life is fairly, and that losing at the game of life is better than cheating at the game of life. And that's why we should reject, the Faustian bargain with chaos, or literally with the devil in that case. Also, to, put it in a more concise way, chaos can give you power, but it's something that's given, and so it has no value because you didn't earn it. You did anything you could, including, cutting up your loved ones, to avoid having to earn things honestly. If you will turn to the warp for power, regardless of what anyone else thinks, that you don't deserve it, and you want it anyway. You know that you're the tyrant. You know that this is ill-gotten, and you will never respect yourself, and neither will anyone else. And I think that's quite a good message from the bad guys. You can go over to them, and you can get some stuff. And by the way, it's not great stuff, and you'll turn into tentacles. But this is only possibly attractive to you if you're a bad person, fundamentally. These are the people that want to smash the board, not play the game. The warp can't make the game of material life be fair. It might lie to you, but it can't make the game any better. It can only put you in the winning position for a while the board bursts into purple flames. And this line of thinking kind of gives me a spicier take about the warp and what it is. I think the warp is communism. And yes, I do genuinely get that message, and I do think I can back it up. I don't even think it's necessarily that much of a stretch. It might not have been intended, but I do genuinely think that that's there to be seen. So, the primary goal of chaos is to tear down civilization. And it's going to use temptation and subversion to prey on the bitter and disillusioned. Every promise that it makes that it's going to build something new in its place is a complete lie. And the warp is not interested in ivory towers or of civilization at all. It's all about the primordial state of man, as we were as animals before society. That is the state of humanity that Marx called communism, primitive communism. The belief is the same for both runs of philosophy, that humans without the baggage of knowledge and civilization and hierarchy and really of self-control at all, of being anything more than an animal, that state is just better. And to put it into a more modern context, the warp's attack on rules and structures and the drive towards emotionality over rationality, of redefining things until they stop working, making rules not mean anything. Yeah, I think that there is something to be seen here. I think there's a good parallel in the way that chaos works, because it's never the toiling underclass masses who become magisters. They become criminals, but they don't turn to the dark gods. And it's those who are a little bit further up who have something, and maybe even a lot of something, but they don't have everything. And they kind of hate that other people have more. Those are the ones that go looking for the dark law. Those are the ones that, decide, I can be a dark priest and then make my own empire, my own whatever, or I can topple all my enemies. I can do all of these things with the power of chaos. And I think that there's a real parallel there. That there are people who find a belief system or an ideology that sort of speaks to their inherent sense of being cheated, and they are willing to follow wherever that leads, because the hatred for those who have more than them is strong enough that it will take them to the ends of madness, to the ends of the warp. It's never trying to build something better for those who genuinely do have the rough end of the stick, who are living at the bottom of the hive city. It's always, oh no, we could be even more richer and powerful. When we do see normal people who get into a bit of chaos worship, they don't really know what chaos actually means. They just get told that, chaos is the new imperium, chaos is the new boss, so you better shape up and follow suit. But they don't really know what it means. And then, finally at the top, the grand chaos warlords are not in fact the true believers of chaos anymore. It's all just become a means to an end to them. They do not believe really in chaos, they just know that it's something they can use for power. All of the grand promises about what could be are just irrelevant. They have become, they've become these strongly individual persons who honestly probably have disdain for the warp more so than anything else, but they know that they need it, and they know that they don't have a full real empire to draw on. They just have to keep going back to that well of power and keep stoking up another cultural revolution, because this time we'll really topple the bad guys. And whenever one chaos incursion fails, a new coven is going to start off somewhere else with the same middle of the pack, resentful, bitter people believing that this time they definitely can control the demons and it's not going to end up in a massive cauldron of bloodletting. I mean, yes, this is a bit spicy, but I think it's appropriate. Now, so what does all this mean? Whether or not you think that Chaos are commies or just, hyper evil, the grand infinite well of bad guyness, the warp is a really good enemy to have, right? Because it's infinite, it's everywhere, it's all the time, and it is whatever bad things you need it to be at any given time. It's super grimdark, obviously, because it likes torturing people to death for no real reason. And of course, the warp winning is worse than anything any material being can ever imagine. It's not even really cartoonishly evil. It's so utterly unchangeably evil, and it'll never, ever, ever stop, because it's already existing at the end of time, and it hasn't stopped, so it's definitely not going to stop. All you can do is guard against it as much as you can. So yeah, as a writer, having the warp as your enemy is really useful, because whatever you need them to do in the plot, sure, they can be doing that. Doesn't have to make sense, doesn't have to happen in the right order even, necessarily. As long as it's somehow tied to chaos, whatever, it's fine. And of course, the warp is this universal thing as well, where everyone needs it to some degree, because otherwise you can't be a spacefaring civilization. So there's always this flirtation with the warp, and sometimes it's just a necessary tool and not just as navigators and astropaths. Sometimes you just need that power. Sometimes you just do. So there's always this tension there for all kinds of reasons, whether you have to work with the Chaos followers this time, or in the future that you have to work with the Orcs or the Necrons or whatever. And I think Chaos is quite resonant as a villain. I think more than anything else in fiction, there's something that's dually natured. They're totally impersonal and elemental, but the followers of them are also individual people with proper personalities, and it has both at once, and they're both always evil. And you can play with whichever one is more useful within your story, so it's good. It's a villain that's almost along the lines of Lovecraft's Old Ones. It's disembodied and everywhere, but it's also found inside the worst people that you can find as well. It's all connected together, and because of what the warp is and how it works, we feel justified in judging Chaos and their minions. They really can't be redeemed in a meaningful sense, and no matter how bad anyone else in the universe might be, because the warp is so selfish and self-obsessed and focused only on its own power, it sort of doesn't matter. Like, no matter what bad things you might have to do, Chaos is always worse, so the bad thing is fine. The story of Imperium in the 41st millennium is what bad things can we dream up to do that are suitably grandiose to make it even seem like it's a choice to get rid of some chaos. The warp's also kind of a fun idea as well, in a sort of spiky, hedonistic, edgy boy kind of way. But I think that's also because we know it's so irredeemable as a force. It plays to the fact that we know that it's a shortcut to power, and that makes it kind of fun to play with as a concept, but no one thinks chaos is good. No one thinks that that's the right way to live their lives. We all know that chaos is a cheat and a shortcut, and part of that is that if it was the correct path, if it was a good path, it wouldn't be a shortcut, it would just be the way. If the warp was a good thing that did good things, then it wouldn't work the way that it does. In that sense, the warp is kind of like the Joker, really useful as a writer, and it's so bad that you can't imagine anyone really throwing their lot in with them. Which is the only real weakness that the warp has. is that it's almost too good of an enemy. Because seriously, why would you throw in your lot with them? They're really terrible. You can be sort of tricked into it, like Horus was. And in fairness, that's how most Chaos followers end up as Chaos followers. It's not because they think it's a good idea, it's because they think something else. No one, even at the very bottom of Imperial society, thinks that being consumed by demons is a good idea. Only the middle class useful idiots who think they know so much better about how the world should be organised are weak to the temptations of the warp. At least if they're sort of delivered honestly, and that's why everything kind of comes in these veils of it offers something else that you do want. It doesn't really tell you its true nature. I would like to see that getting a bit more explored in the lore, actually, though. I think we always show up when people are already cartoonishly evil, and I kind of want to see the fall a bit better. I think that it's almost a bit cheap in the Heresy books that we don't really see Horus develop into his chaotic form. He sort of starts out as a good guy, and then about a book and a half later, he is not. And, well, yeah, he was lied to and he was corrupted and whatever, but it's sort of, he never had a choice, really. He never chose to follow chaos. And I think that that's less interesting. I mean, that's how the canon plays out. You can't do a lot with it, but it would be good to see some people who kind of make a rational choice to follow chaos. That would be interesting. And that gives you an indication that really the warp within any given story comes down to how you use it and how characters relate to it. It's such a big thing and such a general thing, and it has to be that way because it's going to tie together, a million books and 10,000 years of history, and of course it's going to be super mutable and super everything. As a writer, you have to do some heavy lifting to make that meaningful within the story, but that's okay. The warp is there to be used, and it's up to the writer to make something of it. The one thing that is kind of universal in having the warp exist in 40k is that the underlying message is that there's this constant need to reject the warp, and ideally to be building a society that inherently rejects the warp. You can't have the Joker in a healthy society. No one's gonna do business with him. No one's gonna sell him a giant tanker full of acid. That's not gonna happen. And the same is true with chaos. That a robust society that has strong values and that doesn't tolerate this crap has genuinely very little to fear from the warp. And it's not enough to just be aware of the risks either. We see a sort of enlightened secularism in the first Heresy book, with the Interrex, but their scientific kind of approach to the warp just makes them naive and at risk. They don't understand why someone would covet powerful warp artifacts, and that's no damn good. Your society needs to be more moralistic about it. You can't see the warp as being amoral. You need to see it as being immoral. Otherwise, you won't reject it appropriately. If the warp is amoral, if it has no morality to it, then why not listen to what it's saying? Because it seems to be making some sense. And, why not poke at it and see what you can make the energy do? It's not enough to just kind of say, oh, that's over here and that's nothing to do with us. You need to be kind of anti-warp, anti-chaos at all times. And that leaves you with, why it resonates is because it underscores, the basic sort of Judeo-Christian morality tales time and time again, right? The underlying principle for 40k is that, the warp exists and is the worst possible thing you can imagine. It is not just made up to keep people in check, it is really that bad. And with that in mind, the warp is the reason why you need to educate your kids and why you need to teach them good values. You don't just have to make them behave, you need to understand why behaving is good. Your kids need to understand that whatever station they're born into, the only thing is making the best of that. You need to have that sense that, well, if you cheat to get ahead, it's just gonna destroy everything. It's not just gonna burn you, it will burn your house down, it will burn your civilization down. And so even if you are at the bottom, well, that's where you are. Make the best of it you can, because there is no way ahead except working hard. The warp is teaching us that whatever you think the universe could be or should be, that you can only create that by working fairly, by following the sort of the mechanistic, physical laws to build it in a real way. There is no shortcut to a utopia. You have to just build it. And that's a brick at a time, and it's really awful, and you're gonna fail. But if you cheat to get ahead, everything just ends in infinite bloodshed. So that's not really an option. It might tempt you, it might make you think it's an option, but it's not. That's the lesson from the warp over and over again, that the process matters. You can't build anything good on a foundation of bones and ashes. You have to build good foundations, and just accept that it's going to be hard, maybe impossibly hard, but it doesn't matter because your civilization will burn down if you try and shortcut it. Whatever else you've been promised is an absolute lie, and the only thing that matters is building things honestly.